Do you teach anger management classes? The question came to me from the row behind me in a shuttle van coming back from the airport. Had she not been a row behind the inquirer, Amy might have heard the question and rolled her eyes and scoffed at the idea. But nonetheless, there that question hung in the air for a moment. Do you teach anger management classes? We had just returned from a fabulous trip to the Grand Canyon in Southern California. And the flight to get out there was bizarre enough. We had flight delays, a cancellation of a flight, and had to actually relocate from Newark Airport to Philadelphia Airport in time to catch an alternate flight. And in case you're wondering if anywhere on the turnpike it says 65 mph, who knows if that's miles or meters? We don't. But we made it. And then we finally got to our hotel some 26 hours after we'd woken up that morning. But all of that was dull compared to the flight back to the East Coast. And that's where a lot of the information started that brought on that question from the person behind me on the shuttle van. On that flight back, in the row on the plane in front of Amy and myself, was a couple who seemed frail and vulnerable. But looks can be deceiving. Several times on that flight back east, the wife of that couple decided she needed to check what she had in the overhead bin. And being diminutive of stature, she got creative. She actually stood on the armrest of her husband's aisle seat, exactly, to reach into the overhead bin. That seemed impressive enough, and fortunately I was observing the whole thing because my baseball reflexes came into play when I caught the cane that fell from the overhead bin that could otherwise have concussed us in the row behind. Her final high wire stunt came as we were approaching Philadelphia Airport in a storm. And all of those lights and buzzers went on announcing that we needed to be seated with our belts on. But that was not going to stop this lady. There she was, on the armrest of her husband's seat, reaching up into the overhead bin. Up comes the flight attendant. Ma'am, you need to be seated. I'm fine, dear. Ma'am, the lights are on and everyone needs to have their seatbelts on. We're experiencing turbulence. I'll just be a minute. Ma'am, this really isn't safe. This was the best response. Oh, honey, I wouldn't be doing it if it weren't safe. And by this point, the flight attendant was starting to get a little bit agitated. You could tell the gradation of her responses to what was happening. And her final comment before the flight attendant just gave up and walked down the aisle was, "Ma'am, do you climb on your furniture at home?" So all this is happening right in front of where Amy and I are sitting. Across the aisle, Josh is sitting with a mom and her daughter who couldn't have been much more than about 5. And this girl was perfectly behaved this entire flight. The row behind Josh and that family, not so much. A girl who was a little bit older, who seemed to genuinely be okay, except every time they said, "Sit down with your seatbelt on." That was the only time that Sarah needed to use the bathroom and got very upset about it. Her name was Sarah, at least we think it was Sarah. Her parents throughout the flight seemed to pronounce it Sarah. So that was going on for the entire flight. And sharing the same sense of humor, Josh felt the need with me to communicate about it with one another, but everybody was in such close proximity, we couldn't actually talk about it, so we were texting each other across the aisle. And one of the texts he sent me was, quote, "Sarah, stop headbutting people." And I said, this one's too over the top. So I leaned across and I said, this one didn't really happen. And with that, the mom sitting next to Josh leans forward and says, yes, it actually did. So all of this is happening, and I'm convinced that somewhere on this plane is Alan Funt. Like, this is a big candid camera thing. It's all a big joke. But once we were finally liberated from the insanity of this flight, we got to the airport, and it was time to reclaim our luggage. So in some sort of division of labor, Amy and Kate flagged down a shuttle van, while the Clarkson boys went zigzagging between luggage carousels because they kept changing where our stuff was supposed to be. And finally, after missing 2 or 3 shuttle vans, as if they were vans that were taking people away from an earthquake, we finally squeezed onto one. And that's where that question came. Because Josh and I were seated in that middle row of the van, just cracking up at all of the absurdity we had witnessed on the flight. It was kind of like Josh getting to experience what it would be like when I were in high school, cutting up in the back of the class, or in the back of seminary class. So we're laughing about everything that's happening, and that's when this lady asks, "Excuse me, do you teach anger management classes?" And I looked over at Josh for a second and then tried to compose myself to approximate being a grown-up. And I said, no, why do you ask? And she said, because I'm listening to what you're talking about. And if I had been subjected to that on my flight, I would be out of my mind right now, angry at the other people, and angry at the flight, and angry at the luggage carousel. And I stopped laughing with Josh long enough to realize, I guess I could be angry at all of those things, but I wasn't. And I realized there had been things that were inconvenient, things that were unsafe, things that were annoying, but I was laughing. So she had a follow-up question. Well, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a pastor and a chaplain. I used to be a clinical social worker, so I used to do anger management with children in a school, but we just had a great trip. We landed safely in one piece, we found our stuff, and now we've got a great story that will someday end up in a sermon. And then she said, oh, okay, now I kind of get it. Today's gospel from Matthew speaks to us, teaches us what Jesus wants us to know about anger and about anger management. He talks about how we are to relate with one another. He's coming to do what he promised he would do, to fill to the full the law and the prophets. He's basically saying, I know that you all know the letter of the law. You know what was on those stone tablets that Moses received and gave to the people. But to really obey those laws, it goes much more beyond the bare minimum standard of what you need to understand. Because, like most people, I would imagine the people at the time, the people hearing Jesus speak, would probably have thought, well, if I haven't killed anybody, it's all good. And Jesus says, well, not so fast. Our translation, what I read this morning, gives us most of it, but it actually does not give us what the full Greek gives us. The full Greek qualifies that judgment that Jesus says will be due to someone who is angry with someone else. Because in the Greek it says to be liable if you're angry with someone without just cause. You see, anger is a very real emotion. And I believe that Jesus knew that. I mean, after all, isn't this the same Jesus who in the Gospel of John comes into Jerusalem and flips over the tables? English doesn't really have an adequate translation for all of what the original Greek would offer us. We have in there the admonition against insulting someone. In the Greek, it's raka, which roughly translates to calling someone empty-headed. And what we translate as calling someone a fool means more than being not the brightest bulb in the box. Fool, when Jesus communicates it, means someone who rebels against God. Someone who is essentially godless. Perhaps the ones who rebel against God, ironically, are the very ones who carelessly and callously insult or dehumanize other people. May we have the courage, the wisdom, the grace to resist mimicking their paths rather than join and do the same. Yes, Jesus acknowledges that anger exists, and he teaches us what to do with it. Because anger may lead to unnecessary aggression, and that aggression could lead to loss of life. And Jesus tells us the alternative is forgiveness, reconciliation. Contrary to what we may have heard, being a Christian is not always simple or easy. That there are things that each of us wrestle with discerning as we live into these teachings. Each of us bears hurts that shape how we relate to one another. They could shape our very worldview. So I think that this passage is so important to everyone. People in pews and people who stand up front with the religious garb. What indeed is just cause for anger? How is it that we forgive? How do we reconcile? Here again, our translation leaves a little bit to be desired. Where we are told, come to terms quickly. If you're on your way to be dragged to court to defend yourself against someone else, there's more to it than that. What Jesus is telling us is more than be hasty and make everything better just for your own sake. Jesus is saying to be, more directly translated, be well-minded, be well-intentioned, because that's going to affect our thoughts, our attitudes, our actions with one another and with our very selves. If you didn't already know it, when I was speaking to the children, among my favorite of theologians is none other than Mr. Rogers. And he was educated in his understanding of children by the child psychologist, Dr. Margaret McFarland, who said, whatever can be mentioned can be managed. And that truth applies to the full range of our human experience and human emotion. All of which we will find if we start at number 1 and go to number 150 of the Psalms. Everything we could experience is somewhere in there. Our vulnerabilities, our fears, our anger. Identify your anger. Name it. Articulate it. Do that from the place that Jesus describes. Discern the justness of its cause. Author Susan Beaumont, in a book that our presbytery leader has all of the pastors of this presbytery reading, recommends something that, though she doesn't attribute it to Fred Rogers, could easily fit in with his theology. Susan Beaumont writes, "Receive and experience the presence of God. Listen deeply. Practice the discipline of intentionally seeking stillness. If we do these things, maybe we inch closer to living what Jesus teaches. With enough practice, may we discover the Holy Spirit has indeed qualified each and all of us to teach anger management classes."